When it comes to anime and especially battle shonen, let's be real, we are here for those huge finishing moves and big impactful moments. Things like Bankai and Devil Fruit Awakenings and transformations or special abilities. These are those exciting moments that get us hooked on a series. They give us the drips of dopamine that we need to keep the monkey in our brain banging its symbols together so we can keep going. And in Jujutsu Kaisen, we have domain expansions. But of those, which is the best of the best, and why? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to Anime Uproar. I'm your host for today's video, AxelBeats, and today we're going to be ranking the domain expansions from weakest to strongest, as well as giving you a general overview of what each of them can do. And some of these are pretty nutty, so I'm going to try and have a good time. If you enjoy this video and want to see more content like it, remember to leave a like to show support, or if you want to help us out, go ahead and leave a comment down below with ideas for future videos that you'd like to see either about Jujutsu Kaisen, ranking abilities, or even other series that might be popping off that you think we should check out. And of course, you're going to want to subscribe so you don't miss any of the great stuff coming your way. Finally, this video will obviously have manga spoilers, so please proceed with caution. You have been warned. Before we get into the actual list, let's talk about just what domain expansions really are. They can be super varied and unique, but in general, they do have a set of rules which they all follow in some way or another. Basically, in most cases, I like to think of it like locking someone in for a Nen battle if you've seen Hunter x Hunter, or a stand confrontation if you've seen JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. They can be Unga Bunga sometimes, but they can also be incredibly thought out and complex as well. Domain expansions, at their core, are kind of like a combination of a barrier and a person's innate being. Barriers in Jujutsu Kaisen come in their own variety of shapes and sizes as well, but they are more or less walls that have rules applied to them. And the more strict that those rules are, the stronger the wall can be. For example, if you make a barrier with the specific rule that one person cannot enter, it will be incredibly effective against that individual. But if you have a more general barrier that affects everyone equally, it will be much less powerful in comparison. Conditions could also include other things like size, for example, and in most cases, you could expect a barrier around a small area to be stronger than one around a large area. Now, this idea of a barrier is the first real component of a domain expansion. How big of an area it will cover, how many people it can take in, how strong is the sorcerer or curse creating it. These all kind of play into how hard it is to escape an opponent's domain once they set it up. That said, in some cases, the domain expansion user might even opt to not set up a barrier around the domain at all, adding to the risk that the enemy might escape, and meaning that they could increase things like the range or power of their ability instead. It is all a balancing act. Now, the second part of the equation is the person's innate being, their innate domain, as it's called. Domain expansions are quite literally just that, an expansion of the space that a person takes up, an extension of their psyche and abilities. We'll see this later in the list, but for example, Mahito needs to touch people to activate his abilities. However, regardless of how far they are from Mahito themselves, everyone in his domain is considered to be in contact with him. They are in his space, and thus he has contact with them, even if his body is not touching that person directly. Most domains have abilities or rules similar to this, offering guaranteed hits to all of their abilities, and while these attacks can be deflected, destroyed, or overpowered, at the very least they cannot be avoided. On top of this, whoever is creating the domain also gets a huge power boost to their own abilities while inside it as well. Those are the basics of what domains are and how they work. There's obviously more specifics to go into in each individual case, but in general, that's what we're looking at. But with all of that out of the way, we can get into the actual rankings here, and I do kind of feel the need to add a bit of an asterisk here. More so than many other anime abilities, domain expansions fall into that category of things like Nen and stands, where even the weakest ability can offer niche uses which make them incredibly powerful. We aren't working with brute force most of the time, and because of that, a lot of it is left up to interpretation and situation. So while number 1 and number 10 might be drastically different in terms of power, numbers 4, 5, and 6, for example, might be fairly interchangeable on the list, and an argument could be made where any one of them is better than the others. You can almost look at it like a tier system, where things in tier 3 might be interchangeable with each other, but wouldn't compare to tiers 2 or 1. And starting off the list, we do have a few honorable mentions. These three characters, Uro, Ryu, and Yuta, are all known to have domain expansions, but we just don't have any detail on them as of right now. They might be ungodly powerful, or they might be completely pathetic, we just don't know. And because of that, we can't place them properly. But the weakest of the users that we do know is pretty undoubtedly the Smallpox deity. The Smallpox deity is a special grade curse spirit summoned by Pseudo-Geto using his curse spirit manipulation. It was kind of acting as a test for him to really gauge how powerful a grade 1 sorcerer's ability could be, and to see if they were even worth wasting his own time on them. Its domain expansion, Graveyard Domain, sees it slamming its fist into its palm and causing coffins to fall from the sky and lock its target inside. If they can't escape after a few seconds, they'll be infected with smallpox and ultimately die. Now, obviously, like many of the domains on this list, this can be pretty lethal, but the effectiveness and malleability of this ability are the issue here. Firstly, the coffins themselves do not kill the target, meaning if the person can keep breaking out, they aren't really in danger. Second, the Smallpox deity isn't exactly the strongest or smartest on his own, so it more or less automatically targets whoever the strongest source of curse energy is around itself. It's an automated system that can only affect one enemy at a time and only once every few seconds, and thus it is kind of exploitable. For example, in its fight with Mei, despite her being the strongest threat overall, when Ui powers himself up, it makes him the target and opens an opportunity for Mei to exercise the curse. Don't get me wrong, this thing is definitely a threat, especially in a one-on-one fight, but it just isn't versatile or really powerful in comparison to the other things on the list. And I think that something important for me to reiterate here is that none of the abilities I'm talking about today are weak by any means. It's like I'm saying that they're the least talented person at the Olympics. They're still incredibly impressive, but the competition is just more so. At number 10, we have Hiromi Higuruma, who is a defense attorney who took on cases mainly trying to protect people who were wrongfully accused. He inevitably became jaded by the justice system completely, and we see that reflected in his domain expansion, Deadly Sentencing. Deadly Sentencing creates a small courtroom domain surrounded by guillotines where he and his opponent are placed across from one another. This is a fairly unique domain expansion that isn't inherently lethal. In most cases, domains are used specifically to be able to kill the opponent, but in Higuruma's case, it seems to be more about incapacitating people, and lethality becomes a last resort. While this domain does not offer a guaranteed hit, anyone inside of it is forced to follow the rules of the court case. The most important of which being that violence is not allowed, and that anyone inside must take part in the case. This case has three relevant people. Firstly, Judgeman, a Shikigami created by the domain expansion. As his name suggests, he is the judge residing. Second is the prosecutor, Higuruma. And third is the defendant, being whoever he is targeting. Judgeman's thing is that he knows everything about the lives of all people within the domain. He will present Higuruma with one piece of evidence, and the defendant will have to prove themselves to be innocent in the eyes of the court by either lying, telling the truth, or staying silent. However, if there is no hope for the defendant, they can always try to plead guilty and pray for a lighter sentence. Now, the evidence that Higuruma receives is not exactly clear-cut. He won't know the full context nor the full situation, so hypothetically, the playing field should be more or less even. But as Higuruma is a practiced lawyer, he just inherently has an advantage on this kind of situation. As a whole, though, this is just very much a debate in which the defendant is arguing for their innocence and Higuruma is trying to push charges on them, and Judgeman will be the ultimate arbiter of who wins in the end. After this, Judgeman can give a verdict and a sentencing if he sees fit. For example, we see him confiscating Yuji's cursed energy. If Judgeman gives a death sentence, Higuruma will receive an executioner's sword, something which will guarantee to kill anyone that it cuts instantly. So, in general, this domain expansion is pretty strong in its own way, but it just isn't exactly lethal. Firstly, he has to win the court case, which can go either way. Second, even if he does win, the actual sentencing is kind of out of his hand. If Judgeman confiscates cursed energy, that can be a huge advantage, but if the person is strong or fast enough on their own, they might not even need cursed energy to beat Higuruma in a fight. And even if they are sentenced to death, Judge Man doesn't kill that person himself. He gives Higuruma a sword, and then he has to land a hit with it. The biggest problem with deadly sentencing is that nothing is guaranteed. I don't think any domain in the series offers quite so many opportunities for the target to actually escape or succeed, and that's why this is so far down on the list. At number 9, we have another special grade curse, Dagon. Dagon is born from the fear of water-based natural disasters, and this is a super big domain expansion that actually doubles as a base of operation for Geto and the other curses, which, to be fair, it takes the form of a pretty gorgeous beach, which sounds like the best evil villain base that you could hope for. But despite the beautiful setting, this domain expansion, the Horizon of Captivating Skanda, is surprisingly lethal. Here, Dagon is able to produce a countless amount of sea monsters and fish Shikigami that he can launch at anyone within his domain. This is a guaranteed hit ability within his space, and Dagon is even able to split this to target multiple people at once. This is one of the simplest domains on the list. It's just a cool beach where he throws fish at people, and there isn't really much to it other than it solely being an offensive attack. But at the end of the day, someone who is fast or strong enough can just get around it or overpower it. As much as the simplicity of the domain expansion is nice, it's also kind of limiting in terms of options. Next, we have Megumi. This is the first incomplete domain expansion on the list, meaning it doesn't have a guaranteed hit ability. On top of that, it also doesn't have a barrier. And unlike with Sukuna making the most of not having a barrier, Megumi not having one is kind of objectively a weakness, specifically because of how his ability works. At its core, shadows make up the majority of Megumi's arsenal, being able to use the 10 shadow technique to produce different Shikigami that are extremely versatile to assist in all kinds of situations. And building upon this idea is Chimera Shadow Garden. The area that Megumi is in becomes flooded with shadows. It is very much like water, except it's just shadow. There's no resistance, there's no air, and there's no mass to it, meaning the opponent needs to channel cursed energy onto their feet to stay afloat, or they will fall into infinite darkness below them. In this domain, he can freely summon his Shikigami in stronger forms than usual, as well as creating Shikigami clones of himself. It is a very scary and flexible ability, and honestly, it would probably be higher on this list if it wasn't for the biggest flaw, the lack of a barrier. As I said, his ability requires Megumi to flood the area he's in with shadows, meaning it can't be used out in the open. If he could add a barrier to this, it would be able to be used anywhere, but instead he needs to find an enclosed space and lure his opponents into it to get the most of his ability. On top of this, there's something that might be an even bigger issue. Megumi can only sustain this ability for about half a minute. It is definitely a very powerful skill, but at the same time, it has glaring limitations on when and where it can be used that hold it back. Now, moving back to more simple domain expansions, we have number 7, which is Jogo's Coffin of the Iron Mountain. Much like Dagon's domain expansion, Jogo creates an environment. However, this one is much more straightforward and has less counterplay. Jogo locks himself and an opponent inside what is essentially a volcano with a temperature so high that it's stated that an average Jujutsu sorcerer would burn to ash immediately. And while there is more to the domain, that's really the big player here. Things like Dagon's barrage of Shikigami can be deflected or fought off. Megumi's domain is a 30-second survival game. There's things you can do to protect yourself in most of the domains we've mentioned so far. But with Jogo's domain expansion, well, it isn't exactly like you can fight off heat. Once you're in, you're done. And unless you're someone who can straight up overpower Jogo's cursed energy, there isn't really anything you can do about it. As with all other complete domain expansions, Jogo does have a guaranteed hit ability. The volcano that he produces is made up entirely of molten rock, and he can launch or extend this towards enemies to smash into them. So even if you survive the heat, you're going to be beaten down by stone eventually. And sure, that's great, but it's not exactly the most impressive thing that Jujutsu Kaisen has to offer. And if you have people who are going to withstand the heat, they're probably also strong enough to crush the rock as well. That said, Gojo and Sukuna are really the main examples we've seen dealing with this so far, so most people would probably struggle more than we've seen. While this domain is definitely lethal, it again suffers from that simplicity issue where if plan A goes wrong, there's not really much else that it can do. So I think that I'm going to leave it here at number 7. Next up we have Kinji Hakari and Idle Death Gamble. Possibly the most convoluted ability in the entire series, and maybe one of the most dangerous as well. This domain revolves around the game of pachinko. It's more or less a slot machine mixed with pinball and a game of plinko. In pachinko, silver balls will fall down a machine towards the bottom where it has a start chucker, basically a small basket between 2 holes, and the more balls that land in the chucker, the higher your odds of winning become. On top of that, if you match 2 of 3 icons, you can enter a Richie timer, which effectively acts as an extra spin or spins to try and get a jackpot of 3 matching images. But as far as is concerned for Hakari's ability, he's basically trying to hit a jackpot in a game of pachinko, and if he does, he receives the bonus of infinite cursed energy for a short time. When the domain is activated, everyone within it will immediately understand the rules of the domain, and this information dump can also act as a mini version of Gojo's domain expansion, where the person is fed so much information they can't move for a moment. It is a much smaller version, but it might last a few seconds while they process things. It's nothing absurd though. The domain has a few stages it can run through. The normal stage puts he and his opponent in a white space surrounded by turnstiles as he bombards them with pachinko visual effects. These can include colored doors, colored balls, and consecutive spins. The color of the ball that he uses can increase the chance of Hakari getting a jackpot when he gets a Richie. Basically the odds that the third icon will match after a pair. Once he does spin a pair, he can enter a Richie scenario, depicting if he will get a jackpot or not. Now ideally, he would just select the color and raise the odds as much as he can, but they're given to him at random. However, he can use these colors to get an indicator of his odds to succeed, and if he ever sees a gold ball, he is extremely likely to hit a jackpot. On top of that, the game also has a pity timer, so if he keeps losing, he'll eventually get a rainbow ball that will guarantee a jackpot. Then you have things like chance boosters, which give him beneficial effects if he does lose. And all of that fits into the first normal stage. Once he eventually does hit a jackpot, Hakari's domain will break apart, and his reward for this is infinite cursed energy. This means his attacks become devastatingly strong, and if he gets hit by anything, he will immediately perform reverse curse techniques to heal himself from that injury, and he basically becomes an invincible, unstoppable version of himself for about 4 minutes. But here's the thing, once that timer runs out, his cursed energy levels drop from infinite to his normal maximum, meaning he can set up another domain expansion and begin the process all over again. But there will be a small change here. After hitting a jackpot for the first time each day, the next domain expansion will not start in the normal zone, but instead either places him in an increased possibility stage or a faster spin stage, depending largely on if his previous jackpot was because of an even or odd number. The increased possibility path more or less guarantees another quick jackpot, especially when used in combination with consecutive spins. Again, this allows him to get more infinite cursed energy right away and repeat the process again. However, the faster spins can go back to the normal stage if they don't hit jackpots. So, having explained how that works, at least as best as I can, I think I need to reiterate something here. Some of the spots on this list, which not comparable to spots 1 and 2 for the most part, are still unbelievably powerful, and an argument could be made to place any of them above the others. I mean, like I said, Hakari effectively becomes immortal and unstoppable once he hits a jackpot for as long as his luck continues to go. And once he does hit that jackpot, he can manipulate that luck fairly effectively. The only reason I'm placing him here on the list rather than higher is that he still needs to hit that initial jackpot, and in the time that he's trying to do so, he's still vulnerable. On top of that, to make use of his infinite energy, his domain needs to break apart, meaning there are no barriers or walls to keep his opponent near him. And escape, while unlikely, is still possible. This domain expansion is easily on another level compared to what we've seen so far, but the small elements of unreliability stop it from entering the top 5. And luckily, as we move into the number 5 spot, we don't have to talk about anything as confusing as Hakari's, and instead we have... Naoya Zenin. Well, at least there won't be too many confusing ones after this. Time Cell Moon Palace, Naoya's domain expansion, takes the form of this weird uterus-looking fellow that launches unblockable film gauges towards his enemies that apply projection sorcery on a cellular level. The specific effect follows a system of 24 FPS. The very simplified version is that anyone hit with this ability will need to act out 24 very precise actions within the next second at the rate of 24 frames per second, or they can choose to remain totally still and make themselves a target. On a macro level, this could include things as big as moving a finger or bending a leg, but in this case, it also registers movement at the cellular level, like I said, so it's next to impossible to really follow through with for just about anyone. And in the event that you do fail to match this 24 frame system, you are frozen in place for a full second, meaning that it can hit you again and basically lock you in as a sitting duck. Also, a consideration that you have to have here is that you can't control every part of your body, and things like your cells don't regulate on a 24 frame per second system. So your failure rate is just about 100%, as some part of your body, internal or external, will be moving at all times. The ability has a ton of very powerful things going for it, being able to dictate someone's movements, being able to freeze someone in place, forcing your opponent to overthink every action, forcing them to move at an irregular pace. There is so much there, and the only real weakness is that people like Gojo might just be able to either succeed or overpower the cursed energy involved. But like, how many people in the series do you really think could keep track of all the things going on and still be a threat? My guess is about 2 of them, and the same ones who would negate everything else on this list. Of course, if Hakari had infinite cursed energy, he might be able to overwhelm these effects as well, but it basically comes down to who gets things off first, and I think this is just a more reliable ability. Overall, this is just insanely powerful, very disorienting, and because there's no startup luck factor involved, I think it's going to be placed just ahead of Hakari at number 5. On to Mahito in our number 4 spot. Mahito is of course one of the big bads of the series, meaning that his abilities are probably insane, and his domain expansion, Self-Embodiment of Perfection, is no exception. Mahito's big thing is that if he manages to touch someone, he can reshape their soul and disfigure his body any way that he sees fit, often turning them into horrific constructs or monsters, and it's just not a good time. However, it does also have the added benefit of him being able to reshape his own soul and body, which effectively allows him to heal himself or transform body parts into weapons at any moment's notice, which is kinda rad. Now, the big downside of his normal ability is that he has to touch someone, otherwise he can't transform their soul or activate idle transformation. But, as I explained up top, the domain expansion is an expansion of the space that a person takes up, and as such, he is immediately connected to the souls of anyone within his domain expansion and can freely transform them. His only real weakness before is that he could be avoided, but now that's more or less gone. Luckily, that big bonus that he gets is also kind of a downside in specific situations, as he is forced to touch anyone's soul within his domain. So for example, when Yuji enters his domain, Mahito is forced to touch Sukuna's soul, which is a bit of a no-no that leads Sukuna to retaliate and cause enough damage that Mahito's domain collapses. Later in the series, we see him being able to use his domain for 0.2 seconds at a time, which is fast enough to target others in the area without giving Sukuna time to react. Basically, this domain is more or less unstoppable unless you are drastically stronger than Mahito, which is pretty rare. Or unless you negate the effect like Muda does, but I feel like unless you negate it is kind of a dumb excuse in this list and applies to everything else that I'm talking about as well. So we're going to assume that things go as planned, the attack lands, and ultimately this will place him at number 4. And that leaves our top 3, starting with Kenjaku, an ancient sorcerer trying to evolve humanity through cursed energy as he transplants his brain into different people so he can live long enough to see his dream become reality. Kenjaku's domain expansion is Womb Profusion. This produces a massive pillar of cursed spirits, but we don't really know a ton about this ability other than that. We know that it is an open domain similar to Sukuna's, that it has a devastatingly powerful guaranteed hit, and that it is able to counteract powerful barriers and simple domains fairly simply. Couple those things together with the fact that it is Kenjaku's domain, and you have something that's going to be incredibly strong. The reason I'm placing it third, despite knowing less about it than things like Mahito or Hakari's ability, is mostly related to Kenjaku himself, likely having enough cursed energy to overpower those characters, and again, the randomness of Hakari's domain expansion is holding him back here. As far as we know, Kenjaku's domain is more or less a point at someone and watch them be obliterated kind of effect, that also stops others from protecting themselves. Why transform someone or make yourself stronger when you can just eliminate the threat altogether? And of course, that brings us to our second place entry, which was always going to be between Gojo and Sukuna, and personally, I'm leaning on Sukuna as our number 2. His domain, Malevolent Shrine, is an open domain, meaning that there's no barrier around it, and anyone is free to escape. However, by allowing for this weakness in its design, he extends the range to an effective 200 meters from him. And that's where his guaranteed hit comes in, of course having 2 separate forms. Dismantle destroys any inanimate object in that 200 meter range, and Cleave destroys anyone who has any cursed energy in that range. This is more or less instant, so yeah, there is no barrier and people can escape. However, everyone and everything within 200 meters could be instantly killed the second the domain expansion is used, meaning that the idea of escape is never really on the table. It's more or less a false restriction that gets him a massive power boost, and it's just incredibly smart. On top of that, it's just very straightforward and simple. You don't need to think too much about it. He doesn't need to launch fish at people. He doesn't need to drown people in shadows. What does Sukuna's domain expansion do? It destroys everyone and everything that he wants it to. That's it, and you just can't argue with simplicity and efficiency sometimes. Finally, that leaves us with Gojo in number 1. His domain expansion, Unlimited Void, locks his target inside and then floods them with so much information that they are unable to process it. Basically, it overloads their brains so much and so quickly that people stuck in the void for 0.2 seconds are filled with half a year of information and are unable to move for 5 minutes. It works out so that for an average person to be stuck in there for 1 second, they will receive 30 months of information and be unable to move for 25 minutes. And that is for each second that they remain in the domain expansion. And yeah, while this domain is bonkers on its own, you then have to combine it with Gojo. It is one thing to have someone immobilized like Naoya's domain does, albeit Unlimited Void also does so with no real conditions, but to have someone immobile and vulnerable in front of Gojo, who is just straight up stronger, faster, and better than everyone else, and can rip your head off if he wants to, or use his blue, red, or purple techniques, and it's just game over from the second he has you in there. I will note that Unlimited Void's biggest benefit, Gojo, is also its biggest weakness. Because Gojo is, for the most part, unwilling to put civilians in danger, fighting him in crowded spaces effectively locks this ability from being used in any really effective ways. It's why he was only able to open the domain for 0.2 seconds in Shibuya. Meanwhile, if Kenjaku or Sukuna had this ability, it would probably be used without any hesitation. It sucks to be the good guy, I guess, sometimes. Anyways, I think that's going to wrap things up for this ranking video. There are a ton of awesome domain expansions in JJK. I'm definitely a sucker for Naoya's and Mahito's, but let's be real, Gojo's is just so cool that it's hard to argue with that one being the favorite. Let me know which one you think is strongest or which one is your favorite, and where you think I might have misplaced people on this list. Remember, these abilities are largely situational based on when and where and who the user is fighting, and there is a lot of leeway being given when considering which is strongest within a close range on the list. Like, there are obviously tiers, but within those tiers, I think it's pretty hard to know exactly where things fit, you know? Regardless, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more JJK content in the future, remember to leave a like to let us know. And of course, you gotta subscribe so you don't miss any content in the future. There's gonna be a lot of good stuff coming your way. Finally, if you want to support me directly, you can check out my own channel, AxelBeats, where I just made a massive 6-hour video on One Piece. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, I hope you all stay excellent.